Hello, this is Chelsea Jensen for English 091 Online and the digital presentation. I'm here today to talk to you about poetry, Enjambment, and the poem The Question Poems Ask by Raab. In today's presentation, we will cover why the poetic literary device Enjambment is more than a menial device. I intend to highlight Enjambment's importance in poetry using the examples seen in Raab's poem, The Questions Poems Ask. We will also look into the definitions of poetry and prose, highlight the importance of punctuation, and talk about the poetic devices of enjambment and end stopping to better understand how they relate to the poem at hand. Before we get to Mr. Raab's poem, we need to quickly cover some basics, starting with punctuation. Punctuation plays a huge role in any and all forms of writing. Punctuation is a building block for proper grammar in both main forms of writing that you will see in this presentation, being prose and poetry, though how the punctuation is placed in both may differ. In writing, punctuation is used to tell the reader when to do different things in the written works. Things such as how quickly we read by slowing down, speeding up, pausing, or taking a full stop. Punctuation helps us identify where to place emphasis and when to take in details outside of the main work. These things are done using punctuation marks such as a period, comma, colon, semicolon, parentheses, apostrophes, and quotations, among many other marks and uses for punctuation. Now, we will quickly cover the definitions of the previously mentioned prose and poetry. The definition of prose writing, as defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is as follows. A. Prose writing is the ordinary language people use in speaking or writing. Or B. A literary medium distinguished from poetry, especially by its greater irregularity and variety of rhythm and its closer correspondence to the patterns of everyday speech. Moving on to the definition of poetry, also pulled from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Poetry is 1. A metrical writing or a verse. 2. The productions of a poet or poems. 3. Writing that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience in language chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. In poetic writing, many or most of the same grammatical rules apply as they do in prose writing. However, many poets will use punctuation to change the tone and tune that a poem is read to with greater effect than in most prose writing. This is where we start getting into the poetic literary devices such as enjambment. So what then is enjambment? Enjambment, from the French meaning a striding over, is a poetic literary term for the running over of a sentence or phrase from one poetic line to the next, without terminal punctuation, which is the opposite of lines that are end-stopped, as in ending with a period or having a stop at the end of each line. So when there is no comma, period, or other punctuation at the end of a poetic line, due to the lack of punctuation, instead of reading through and putting a stop at the end of each line, you keep reading the next line as a direct continuation without pause. So now that we have covered some of those basics, let us move on to the poem in question, The Question Poems Ask by Raab. Starting in the first stanza, and even the first line in that stanza, we see our first example of enjambment. Watching a couple of crows playing around in the woods, swooping low after each other, I wonder if they ever slam into trees. The only line in this stanza that comes to an end stop is the fourth and final line of the stanza. If we were to read this poem without the enjambment, it would sound more like this. Watching a couple of crows, playing around in the woods, swooping. In low after each other, I wonder if they ever slam into trees. Continuing on to the next couple of stanzas read using enjambment. There's an answer here. Unlike most questions in poems, which are left up in the air, Was it a vision or a waking dream? Much like the first stanza, enjambment is seen here on the first line, though the following 3 lines all feature an end stop. You decide, says the poet. You do some of this work, but think carefully. At this point, we see a new example of enjambment. With the 4th line of the 3rd stanza, we note that there is no punctuation to finish the stanza with. So much as we have done before, we will continue reading as if there were no break. Some people want to believe poetry is anything they happen to feel. That way, they are never wrong. Others yearn for the difficult, insoluble problems, secret codes not meant to be broken. Nobody, they've discovered, ever means what he says. As you can see here, Lawrence Raab thoroughly and repeatedly uses enjambment throughout his poem. I have added arrows to all of the points of enjambment up to this point. As you can see, without enjambment, the placing and fluidity of the poem would not come through, as it would be disjointed, producing sharp sounds that do not provide an adequate flow to the poem. Now that we have taken a thorough look at the first half of the poem, it is time to finish reading the poem without interruption. Following the use of enjambment, you will note that it flows smoothly and rhythmically. But rarely does a crow hit a tree, though other clumsier birds bang into them all the time. And we
I'm
see
recording
these
now,
birds
but
have
not with a
adapted well
microphone.
to the forest environment. Frequently stunned, they become easy prey for the wily fox, who's learned to listen for that snapping of branches.
Can I have 2 minutes?
Wings. Who knows where to go and what to do when he gets there. Throughout his work, Lawrence Raab has shown masterful skill in his use of enjambment.
I'm pretty sure I'm at under a minute
His
at this point.
thought-provoking poem flows easily through the mind and voice.
I just have to make sure to click next
the
slide
punctuation adds
at
definition
the right
and
time.
grace to his metaphors and should be taken note of. I hope that you may learn from this fluid style and work to implement its artfulness within your writing. Enjambment may sound like a menial device, but its control over the flow of a piece makes it infinitely important.